Ladies and gentlemen, get ready now.
Thank you. Americo Carrasco will be performing. I am Rabbi Ari Rosenberg. I'm the rabbi here at Temple Shalom, and I just want to say to everyone, welcome, welcome, welcome. We're thrilled that you've all come here this evening. I would say that the essence of any legitimate religion is its morals and its values, and in Judaism we have a value called Haknasat Orchim, which is a value that we find in other religions as well. It's welcoming people into your home as guests. And when I first came to this town, the first people to welcome me was actually Nadine Strassen and Ellie Noam. They reached out to me before I even came to town. They invited me over their wonderful home, and it was just such a great introduction to this town and the wonderful people here. Come to find out, they happen to be the nicest people in the world. Scholars, absolutely brilliant. I had the opportunity to hear Nadine speak at New York Law School about a year and a half ago, and I was so impressed at how eloquently. She could articulate very sophisticated topics in a way that was not just edifying, but it was also entertaining. And I learned quite a lot on that occasion. I've been begging her for 3 years now to come and speak. And now that we have this phenomenal book that hopefully we will sell out of these books this evening, I'm thrilled to be able to present Nadine Strossen. You don't want to hear me speak. You really want to hear her. So I'll bring her forward.
Wonderful introduction and the warm welcome, and I would like to thank not only Ari but so many other people who worked on putting together this fantastic event. So here at the Temple, also Tamara Potter for the amazing music, Americo Carrasco, who's going to be performing here with his Reggae Bones Band next Saturday, April 14th at 7:30 p.m. Mike Latini, who is going to be performing afterwards during a reception. And as a special bonus to anybody who is good enough to buy a book, I am adding as the frosting on the cake, so to speak, a copy of Mike's wonderful new CD called Ace, that's his nickname, Ace Rides Again. And Mike, thank you for color coordinating with Mike. It was all a plot all along. And I'd also like to thank Holly and Steve, Terry and Mike from the Bank Street Book Nook for arranging to sell books here, and also Vanessa and David Gronbeck, the previous owners of the bookstore, who were also very helpful with those arrangements in the transition period. Bob Brophy and Felicia Michael of the Blue Yodels for arranging the after party, and many others who will be participating in that. Patrick, Coach Burns, I don't see him, but he helped with the wine that you are all going to be imbibing, I hope. And by the way, you may drink while you listen. I think that could make you a happier audience. I won't complain. And I want to also thank Susan Randell for publicity and Laura Ballou for publicity. And I'd like to thank Ben Solnit from the ACLU of Connecticut for coming here, and I hope he'll stand up so people can see who he is. Ben is the incoming president of the ACLU of Connecticut, so if anybody ever violates your freedom, he'll be there to help you. And I want to, of course, thank each and every person who has come here on what's turned out to be a beautiful afternoon. Your time and your attention and your friendship and your support are so special to me. I can't tell you, which is why I have been looking forward to this event for so long, ever since we planned it, which was quite a long time ago. My schedule is very packed, and I've already apologized to my friends here for being scarce because I'm traveling all over the country and even a couple of speaking engagements overseas. So forgive my absence for that reason. But of all those events on my schedule, this is the one that really I've looked forward to the most by far. And it's not only because, as a very, very nice coincidence, it turns out this is literally the first event at which the book is actually available. It's not even, it hasn't even been officially published yet. That's not going to happen until May 1st, when I'm going to have the official launch event in New York City. But the publishing industry, Jean, who's somewhere here, knows it very well. There's a release date, and the books were released from the warehouse on April 2nd, and thanks to the efforts of the bookstore, it did get here on time. So it's very special. This event is very special for that reason, but that's superficial. The real reason why it's so special is the incredible support and nurturing that I have had, along with my husband, Ellie Noam, who is far more prolific than I am. But both of us have enjoyed our experience of thinking and reading and writing in this community where we have so many friends. And as I look out in the audience, there's almost nobody here that I can't identify with having provided some encouragement, some support, and such enthusiasm. It's really wonderful. I did not have enough space because we're told that audience members' attention spans are short, so I was censored in the amount that I could write, including in the acknowledgments, and so I could not possibly thank everybody that I wanted to thank, but I did thank Robert Schachter. I'm not sure if he's here, he was going to come, for wonderful advice, and I'll say more about that later. And I also thanked many, many talented singer-songwriters in this community and the restaurants that host them, because as many folks know, Ellie and I have the habit of going there, and we do dance and sing and talk, but we also work on our laptops. And you've been far more inspiring to Ellie than you have to me, because he's told me he's written 9 books since we have lived here, and I've only written this mere one. So, but I'm not going to quarrel about that. You've created a round number 10 between Ellie and me, and I really enjoyed thanking so many musicians. I won't read all of the names here, but I am going to read the conclusion of the portion of the acknowledgments where I do thank, I say I was fortunate to do much of the work on this book while being inspired by the beautiful live music performed at restaurants near my New Milford, Connecticut home, and I then list the names of the talented musicians, and conclude that section of the acknowledgments by saying, all of us raised our voices along with many other neighbors against hateful expression that in August 2017 temporarily defaced property in our community, but whose enduring effect has been to renew our commitment to overcome hatred and discrimination. And that really is the message of the book. So it's such a wonderful circle, if you will, that the last time that I was at an event that so many members of the community came here to Temple Shalom was what the wonderful event that Ari and other faith leaders and other community leaders organized to express our opposition to that incident of hate crime, by the way. I'll explain that in a moment. So completely subject to punishment and criminalization under our law that's as distinct from hate speech. And so it's really wonderful to be here again celebrating the same values. I wanted to start explaining the concept of the book by looking at the cover, because the cover, and I don't know if Chris Ellis is here. Chris is a talented designer as well as musician, and I talked to him about potential ideas for the book cover, and he said he doesn't really specialize in that, but I was so amazed when the cover was presented to me at Oxford University Press. I didn't see it in advance, but the designer I thought was brilliant because through just very few elements had managed to convey a quite complicated message that took me almost 200 pages to explicate. I know you can't all see it from here, but the design, which of course does include 2 of my favorite colors, so I'm going to enjoy dressing to match the book for a while. But it is so resonant with Nazi placards in particular, right, and banners and armbands, so there is an ominous aspect to that red and black. And of course you see the word hate in such big, bold letters because it is a very serious problem. And we know that it is a mounting problem from surveys that are consistently done by the Anti-Defamation League, the Southern Poverty Law Center, various journals, and it is a serious problem all over the world, in the United States, in Connecticut. And I believe that all of us have to have a responsibility, a moral responsibility, to do what we can to stem the existence and expression of hatred and discrimination and stereotyping. So my goal is to overcome it. In fact, I was kind of pleased when my dear husband with a very acute eye, he actually thought that the subtitle made the hate diminish too much. And I said, well, that's perfect, because that's exactly the message that I'm trying to convey. Why we should resist it with free speech, not censorship. So I want the hatred to be overridden as well as overwritten. And one detail that I asked to meet the book designer, because I so admired his artistry, and he pointed out something that even I, as a constitutional law professor, I'm embarrassed had not noted, which is, some of you are ahead of me on this, right? That the font that he used for the subtitle is the font that is in the Constitution. So it's wonderful symbolism. I wanted to say that this same message that I'm trying to convey, that another way of saying it is that we should resist hate, and we should do it with free speech, not censorship. That same message has been endorsed by every major civil rights organization and civil rights leader in this country throughout history, since we sadly had to mark this past week the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. I always quote him, but I feel especially moved quoting him now, because even though his life was tragically foreshortened, his words and his teachings are immortal and just so eloquent. He is one of, I quote him very often in the book. He provides one of 3 epigrams at the very beginning of the book, one of which is the following: in the end, what we will remember more than the words of our enemies is the silence of our friends. So we all have a moral responsibility, and if you are silent, that is conveying a message, right? You have no way of staying out of this debate. You are conveying a negative message through your silence, and obviously I'm preaching to the choir, because these are all of you, and it's one of the reasons I cherish this, who care deeply enough to raise your voices in many ways, including through speech and through song and through poetry and other media as well. Bringing it to current days, Barack Obama, I discovered when I saw the index, I just saw that the index wasn't in the prior pre-publication version, so I just got to see it for the first time yesterday, and far and away, the person I quote more often than anybody else in this book is Barack Obama. He has been eloquent and tenacious in his condemning of hate speech, but also condemning of censorship, and exhorting people, in particular college students, in particular minority students, to raise their voices, to not allow themselves to be intimidated and silenced, and all the negative impacts that can result from hate speech. In addition, civil rights organizations that specialize in monitoring and combating hateful crimes have also opposed censorship and advocated what we lawyers call counter speech, and that's basically raising your voice in any way to counter either the existence or expression or potential negative impact of hate speech. So it can be providing support to people who are disparaged by hate speech. It can be providing education to prevent people or to instill positive ideas, true information that will immunize them from being susceptible to false and hateful ideas. It can include rebutting and arguing against offensive or discriminatory ideas. It can include advocating for government officials to adopt and enforce policies that criminalize hateful crimes and discriminatory actions. So a whole panoply of tactics, all of which are much more effective than censorship, as well as being completely consistent with First Amendment equality and democratic principles. Two of the organizations that are leaders in this area are the Anti-Defamation League, and I'm not sure how familiar everybody is with the activities of the ADL. I think when I first heard about it, my impression was that it specializes in protecting rights of Jews against anti-Semitism. But the ADL is, and that is a very important part in this country and this state, as well as around the world. But the ADL is an all-purposes anti-discrimination, pro-inclusivity, diversity, civil rights organization. And I was very heartened to see an article in one of my favorite newspapers, the New Milford Spectrum. I have to be diplomatic, so that's why I'm only saying one of. I have a friend from the New York Times who might be here. And the article was called Anti-Defamation League, subtitle, Not in Our Town. Communities take action as incidents increase in state. This, as a real coincidence, I'm not sure if the Spectrum knew this, it happened to be the December 15th, 2017 edition, and I'm not sure the editors know that December 15th is the exact anniversary of the adoption of the Bill of Rights, including the First Amendment. So that was a wonderful coincidence. And it shows a picture of the horrible vandalism at Thompson's restaurant, and it shows, it's similar to the theme of the cover of my book. What it shows is somebody there, a volunteer, and we have many volunteers that are striking out that image and that defacement and beginning the enormous, wonderful surge of support and counter speech that we saw in this community. It's a long article. I just want to read you a few statements because they are so resonant with the message that I'm trying to convey as well. It quotes a lot somebody I have not yet had the pleasure of meeting, Andy Friedland, who is Assistant Director of Connecticut's Anti-Defamation League, and he said, the measure of the community is how they respond. So we should not be judged by the hate mongers who committed that act of defacement. We rise above that. It was the community's response that I think is what really counts. The article then talks about how the response, and I remember Ari and others talking about this when we were here in August, that this is not just going to be a one-time thing, a one-time show of support. We are building an ongoing community and network and commitment, and one manifestation of that is the New Milford Clergy Association, together with residents, created a community group, New Milford United. One member, Darlene Alvarez-Mattern, who used to work for the ADL, and I'm sorry I haven't had the chance to meet her in person, she said that residents here didn't seem to realize that racism existed in New Milford. She hopes informing the community about everyday prejudice will spur more people to help prevent such incidents. Well, that is one of the silver linings to the cloud of hate speech, that if people have hateful ideas and discriminatory ideas, I would rather know about it than not know about it, for a number of reasons, including the opportunity to take countermeasures, both with respect to them as individuals, and in researching my book, I came across so many inspiring examples of people who were leaders of hateful organizations, including alt-right organizations, who were weaned away. So we should not just exclude them from humanity and say, you know, they're haters, they're racists, they're beyond the pale. We should reach out. And that's one of the things that I so admired about Dr. King, that he refused to turn his back on anybody. He refused to give up in trying to find the love that he believed to be inherent in everybody, and to try to develop that and call it out no matter how much he was subject to hatred himself. And it may sound like an idealistic, unworkable strategy, but actually political scientists who have studied that kind of non-violent approach to countering hateful and violent ideologies have documented that it is far more effective than violence and militant approaches. I just want to read one other statement here from, this one comes from Marjorie Lipschitz Shapiro, who is also with the Connecticut ADL. And she said, for the target of any hate incident, when they hear about a group of people saying, not in our town, that's where the healing starts. And then it ends by quoting Mr. Friedman from ADL again, who says, sunlight is the best disinfectant. The only answer for speech that you disagree with, in this case, hateful speech, is more speech. Good speech that promotes equality, respect, and tolerance. And to that I say amen, and women, as I always like to add. And you know, that is the philosophy of the First Amendment. The great Supreme Court decisions that, opinions that first started championing the robust free speech that we have enjoyed since about the middle of the last century, first written among others by the first Jewish justice on the Supreme Court, Louis Brandeis, said that the answer to any speech except that which creates a emergency, that because it directly causes specific, imminent, serious violence, then and only then may you censor it. Other than that, the answer is more speech that counters the speech that you find more generally threatening. So that's a firm First Amendment principle, but it also is an effective strategy. And I therefore thought that it was wonderful to be able to solidify my views through researching and writing the book, that there are what we lawyers would call two independently sufficient reasons for refusing to censor hate speech. One is a matter of First Amendment principle, that it would violate core notions, what the Supreme Court has called the bedrock principle of freedom of speech. Again, we lawyers call it viewpoint neutrality, that government may never censor speech merely because the community, even the vast majority of the community, disagrees with or dislikes the viewpoint or message that the speech conveys, no matter how deeply reviled that might be. I think a good statement that that conveys that philosophy we've all heard attributed to Voltaire. I may disagree with what you say, but I defend to the death your right to say it. So that's one reason for supporting freedom of speech, even for, to quote Oliver Wendell Holmes, the thought that we hate. Another reason, even wholly aside from that, is that censorship just does not work. Now, people who advocate censoring hate speech, and I respect their concerns, I share their concerns, they say that the speech can potentially cause harm of various types, psychic and emotional harm, potentially leading to discrimination, potentially leading to violence, potentially leading to a breaking down of community relations. Well, all of those harms, I do have to say, are only potential harms. They don't necessarily follow from speech. And here's where I want to again tip the hat to Dr. Bob Schachter, because he was one of a number of mental health and psychological experts with whom I consulted and read their writings, and kind of consistent with common sense, but it's always nice to have experts confirm that there's scientific validity to the theories as well. words do not directly harm us. So that's the truth of that old nursery rhyme, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Of course words can hurt us, right? They can break our hearts, they can wound our pride, they can insult our dignity, and on and on and on and on. But they only do so through the intermediary functioning of your own mind. How you perceive, how you interpret, how you receive, and how you respond. So they do not directly harm the way sticks and stones do. And psychological experts attest that whether we have, all of us are born with different levels of resiliency in resisting the potentially wounding force of words, but we can all be trained to become better at that. And a number of cognitive behavioral therapists now are urging that these techniques be taught to everybody, including in particular so many college students, that it's not inevitable that you respond to even the most awful insult by feeling yourself demeaned. And in my book, in addition to quoting psychological experts, I also quote political activists, including Barack Obama, Van Jones, many others who exhort, again, especially minority students, don't let them turn you into a victim at best or a survivor at worst. Maintain your dignity and your self-confidence, and you can actually get a sense of empowerment and activism by responding, either by walking away or by answering back. One of the other people I love to quote, I have quoted her right at the beginning of my book, is Ruth Simmons, who was the first African-American president of any Ivy League university. She was president of Brown University from 1991 to 2002. And way back in 1991, when she was giving her first, and I should also say she was the first female president of Brown, so a double pathbreaker. And she, way back in 1991, in her very first convocation address as president of Brown, she said something that is so prescient, because that was before we started hearing what have now become rampant calls on college campuses to censor any speech that makes any student feel uncomfortable, right? And she said, I'm going to read her exact words. I can paraphrase, but I can't really do justice to it. She says, you know something that I hate? When people say, that doesn't make me feel good about myself. I say, that's not what you're here for. I believe that learning at best is the antithesis of comfort. And I know there are a number of professors in the audience, including another law professor I just had the pleasure of meeting today. That is such a great description of what it's our responsibility to do. Learning at its best is the antithesis of comfort. If you come to this campus for comfort, I would urge you to walk through yon iron gate. But if you seek betterment for yourself, for your community and posterity, stay and fight. So from a psychological perspective, at the individual level, from a community perspective in terms of improving our community and our society, we can rise above the hatred, and we can respond, and we may be able to reform and recruit away some hate mongers, but we certainly can prevent them from damaging individuals and damaging our community. Okay, I want to say one more point about the law here, which is that in addition, so and I'm sorry, because I previewed this, but I didn't give you a full explanation. So I'm going to have to start by backing up to answering the question, which is, what is hate speech? I'm using air quotes now, and throughout the book, I use quotation marks every time I use that phrase. Why? Because there is no such thing, in the sense that there is no legally accepted concept of hate speech, that because the Supreme Court has never defined a particular category of speech based on its hateful or hated message and said that speech is not subject to First Amendment protection. So that's different, for example, from obscenity, which is a legal term of art for a specific subcategory of sexual expression that the Supreme Court has defined and has said is not subject to First Amendment protection or is denied First Amendment protection merely on the basis of its content, its ideas, its messages. To the contrary, the Supreme Court has repeatedly and resoundingly said that even a hateful message that we hate is protected. And let me give you the most recent example of the court doing that, because it will illustrate that what is at stake here is not only freedom of speech for individuals, but also equality protection for everybody, including members of minority groups. So this was a case that the Supreme Court decided last June. It decided it unanimously, which really shows how well accepted these legal principles are. As most of you know, this is a Supreme Court that is deeply divided on constitutional issues. It usually votes 5-4 or even more fragmented ways. So to have everybody from Sonia Sotomayor on the left to Samuel Alito on the right agree shows that it's a really consensual, accepted constitutional principle. So this was a case called Mittal versus Tom. It involved Simon Tom, who, oh, and this is so perfect with all of the musician friends here in the audience, a musician, a rock musician, Asian American, who formed a rock band with other Asian American men, and they named themselves the Slants. Of course, that's a terrible epithet that has been used for a long time to attempt to demean and degrade and dehumanize people of Asian origin. Guess what? That's not the reason why they chose the name. No, as you can guess, they were trying to reappropriate that term, as many in the LGBT community have done with the word queer and the word dyke, for example, to try to diffuse the power, to take away the hateful sting, to disempower those who would use the word as an epithet, and to say, no, we're reclaiming our ethnic pride. We are asserting our dignity by using that name. Well, guess what? It turns out that in the United States Code, in the section on trade names and trademarks, there was a hate speech law buried in there, which basically forbade the government to give trade name, trademark approval to any term that is disparaging or demeaning. And the Supreme Court struck that down unanimously, consistent with a long, long line of cases. And I think it really beautifully illustrates the mutually reinforcing relationship between freedom of speech and equality, individual dignity, protecting the rights and dignity and empowerment of members of minority groups, right? Simon Tam and his band would have been denied all of those rights if the Supreme Court had not ruled the way it did. Aside from that principle that, so hate speech is not a legal term of art. I will stop, I'll spare you the air quotes from here on, but I want you to imagine them. Imagine them. I use the term the way most people use it, which is the way most people use it most often, which is speech that does convey discriminatory, stereotyped attitudes on the basis of certain demographic characteristics, especially those that have been traditionally and still are subject to a lot of discrimination, including race, religion, sexual orientation, and so forth. That said, if you have your antenna up from now on, you will notice that people use the term much more profligately to refer to whatever speech they hate. So I've heard fake news described as hate speech, revenge porn, burning the American flag. Donald Trump calls taking the knee hate speech. But understand this would be the consequence if we created a new category of unprotected hate speech. It would essentially come down to whatever those who have sufficient power in government or on campus, officials to decide, I hate that idea, and that's the one that's going to get censored. A hate crime is a constitutional law term of art. I think the word bias crime, which is a synonym, conveys the meaning even a bit better. But starting about 20 years ago, at the impetus of the Anti-Defamation League, states and now the federal government all around the country have adopted statutes, bias crime statutes, that take an act that would already be a crime, such as the vandalism that we sadly had here in New Milford, or an assault, and says if the victim of that crime is singled out because of a discriminatory reason, we can treat that as a more serious crime subject to an enhanced penalty because it does more harm both to the individual victim and to the society as a whole. So there is no civil liberties or constitutional law objection. To the contrary, one of the steps that should be taken to protect us against discrimination, actual discriminatory conduct, is the enforcement of these hate crime laws. Now, even beyond that, there are certain contexts where hate speech can be punished, and I've already alluded to it. Remember, I said that it can't be punished just because we despise and loathe its viewpoint. That's the viewpoint neutrality principle. But I also earlier referred to the second major free speech principle in our law, which I call the emergency principle, taking the name from the one that Justice Brandeis, who was the inventor of it, used. And that is, if the speech, not just because of its content, but because of the context in which it occurs, does pose a direct danger of causing specific, serious, imminent harm, then it may and should be punished if no other step is effective. So you certainly try to use law enforcement to prevent the harm. You may try to use education or counter speech, but if all else fails, then as a last resort, you can and must punish the speech. And so I can give one example from a campus, sadly. Well, one example is a so-called true threat. And we lawyers say true threat because it's got a specific legal definition, not the general way we tend to use the word threats more loosely. Oh, I feel so threatened by that message on that t-shirt. No, a true threat is when the speaker intends to instill a fear of being attacked or subject to some harm in a specific person or small group of persons to whom the speech is addressed. And a good example, sadly. So if hate speech is used in such a context that it does instill intentionally instill a fear, and by the way, it has to be a reasonable fear. So it's not just that somebody is very thin-skinned and subjectively feels fear, but if a reasonable person in that position would feel the fear, then that hateful speech can and should be punished. And let me give you an example from, involves somebody that I've had the pleasure to meet a couple of times. Her name is Taylor Dumpson. She was elected as the first African-American student body president at American University last year. I was surprised that she was the first, but I understand that there was some hostility on campus because on the day that she was taking office in that important position, strewn around the campus were a number of bananas in nooses. I know, I still get chills every time I think about that. And as if that message was not targeted enough, the bananas had written on them the initials of her sorority, which was a predominantly African-American sorority. Of course that satisfies not only the true threat standard. Now the law professor in me wants to ask you, how else could we punish that? I already told you, it's a hate crime, right, or a bias crime, because a true threat is a crime, no matter against whom it's committed, but when the victim is intentionally singled out for a discriminatory reason, it then becomes subject to enhanced punishment as a hate crime. So I think that our law is exactly right in drawing the line between hateful ideas, which should not be punished just because we hate the ideas. We have other more effective methods for responding to them, but it can and should be punished when in the many contexts it does satisfy the emergency standard. And I think that this nuanced nature of US law just is not nearly as well appreciated as it should be. There are so many politicians who will say hate speech is not free speech. And conversely, there are too many who say, oh, hate speech should be absolutely protected. And I think our legal system has it exactly right in drawing that distinction. Now, even putting aside this principled reason for opposing censorship of hate speech, there is an independently sufficient reason. I was thinking here in a synagogue we would say dayenu, right? Either message, either reason would be enough, but the second reason is a pragmatic, strategic one that I already alluded to. Now, Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, most other democratic countries in the world, South Africa, as well as undemocratic countries, they do enforce hate speech laws. And so the United States is in a distinct minority on this issue. But what's interesting, and one of the things I learned in doing research on the book, is in the last few decades, as a result of seeing how these laws actually work, or I should say actually do not work in operation, so many human rights activists in these other countries have become completely disillusioned and disenchanted and said we ought to move more in the direction of the United States, move away from censorship and toward reinvigorated responses from the civil society, right? All of us as individuals and community members raising our voices. So, for example, even the European ECRI, the European Commission on Racism and Intolerance, which for decades have been at the forefront of advocating the adoption of stricter and stricter hate speech laws in European countries, a couple of years ago did a report based on the abject failure of those laws to suppress discriminatory conduct and discriminatory violence, which has been on the rise in Europe in very tragic ways against not only Jews and immigrants, the Roma, the Gypsies, Turks in Germany, many ethnic minorities. ECRI said, so it not only is it not working in bringing about an end to discrimination in a more unified, integrated, diverse society, but also, and predictably, these laws are being used disproportionately to silence the voices of the members of the minority groups who were supposed to be protected, and also being used against political dissidents wherever they might be, whatever views they might have in a particular society. And that should not be surprising, right? That way, that pattern of enforcing these laws, similar to the enforcement of other criminal laws, think of the drug laws or the traffic laws. We know the patterns. The ACLU here in Connecticut, as well as around the country, has done a lot of studies that show that they are systematically, disproportionately enforced against members of minority groups. I accept the fact that we have ongoing systemic structural discrimination in our criminal justice and civil justice system, and I thank all members of law enforcement who are struggling and working, making strides to overcome that. I applaud those efforts. As individuals, studies show that none of us is immune from the so-called implicit or unconscious bias that not surprisingly, in a society and a culture, that we would acquire those attitudes. And again, many wonderful steps are being taken for us all to all become aware and to overcome them. But it seems to me, given those challenges in our institutions of the justice system and in us as individuals, the last thing that we would want to do is to turn over to those structures what is inevitably a subjective discretionary power to decide which speech is sufficiently hateful that we are going to subject it to punishment. It's not going to result in enforcement that is systemically in favor of anybody who is in any kind of minority, whether it's a political minority or a demographic minority. And so there's certainly no, so I was going to quote ECRI, in a study that it did a couple of years ago, it said that counter speech is much more likely than censorship to be effective both in stemming the existence of hateful attitudes and expression and in curbing any potential adverse impact. And I could give you many other examples of that. I just, here in synagogue, I think I have to mention France, with all of the dramatic incidents that have gotten a lot of publicity, including lately, there's a new book out about anti-Semitism in France, even despite the fact that France, along with Germany, has the strictest anti-hate speech laws in the world. And France, in something that I certainly don't applaud as a Jew or as a human rights activist, has enforced laws that, its hate speech laws, even against any expression of any idea that is critical of Israel. So Le Monde, which is sort of the counterpart of the New York Times in France, a respected mainstream newspaper, was criminally convicted for an editorial in which it criticized a particular policy of the Israeli government. So in other words, extremely extreme enforcement of anti-hate speech laws against an extremely broad, I would say overbroad concept of anti-Semitism doesn't even correlate with a reduction in anti-Semitic attitudes and anti-Semitic violence. Okay, I don't want to talk too long because I want to have time for questions and answers. And Ari, you should tell me, give me a 5-minute warning, because I could go on forever. I want to, so, asserted harms. There's debate as to the extent to which hate speech actually does cause any of the harms. I've got a whole chapter that deals with that. But even assuming, for the sake of argument, that the speech did cause individual trauma, psychic harm, violence, or discrimination, censoring the speech at best would be an ineffective way of addressing those harms, and at worst, a counterproductive way. One example of one reason for the counterproductive nature was mentioned in this article. As I said, if there is actually discrimination, discriminatory attitudes, it's much more useful to know about it than to suppress it, right? Where it can erupt in violent actions. If we don't know who the people are who have those attitudes as they reveal through their speech, we're not going to be able to try to nip the attitudes in the bud before they erupt into violent actions. Also, and this is something that has been observed with respect to both Nazis in Germany and neo-Nazis here in the United States, that censoring people tends predictably to amplify their message. It draws attention to them that they never would have received otherwise, and it increases the sympathy that they have. So I should tell you that my father he died unfortunately in 1999, but he was a Holocaust survivor. He was born in Berlin in 1922 as, under the Nuremberg laws, what was called a half-Jew. His mother was of Jewish descent, and he was enslaved. I can say my father was an enslaved individual. Ellie and I visited the salt mine at Buchenwald, the forced labor camp, where he was enslaved, and scheduled to be sterilized literally one day before he was liberated by American military. So I really, really owe my life to the United States military. I love speaking to military audiences. And truly, you know, I do criticize excesses and abuses in the criminal justice system, but one of the things I love about the ACLU, and Ben knows this well, is that we never criticize or praise any institution or individual wholesale. We do it on an issue-by-issue basis, and every individual and every institution and every organization, they're to be applauded and praised on some issues and criticized on others, ourselves included. So I'm very, very grateful. I think that, I know that we could not enjoy our liberty did we not have basic law and order and security. So many thanks to those who do that. They are upholding the law and our rights. Now, with respect to the Nazis in Germany, I'm going to associate myself with a statement that I quote in my book from a man named Aryeh Neyer, who was himself a Holocaust survivor. He was born in 1932 in Germany, and this is kind of a funny story. He was born 2 days after Hitler's birthday, at a time when Hitler's birthday was a huge national holiday, and he was born a little bit late, and he swears that his mother held off giving birth to him to coincide with Hitler's birthday. But anyway, Aryeh was the ACLU's executive, so he and his immediate family did escape. The rest of his family was completely slaughtered. When he came to this country, he became a human rights activist, and he was the executive director of the ACLU in 1977 to 78, when we handled what was until then our most notorious case. Charlottesville may have overtaken it. But very similar cases, the ACLU came to the defense of the free speech rights of a group of neo-Nazis to demonstrate in a town called Skokie, Illinois, which had not only a large Jewish population, but many of them were Holocaust survivors as well. And it was a slam dunk winner in the courts of law, right, because of that viewpoint neutrality principle that I told you about. They were not presenting an emergency threat. So we won, hands down, in the courts, all the way up and down the state system and the federal system, all the way to the US Supreme Court. But in the court of public opinion, it was very controversial. And even the ACLU itself, this band of stalwart free speech defenders, lost about 15% of our members who wanted to make just one exception to free speech for the idea that they considered the most loathsome. Well, of course, as one of my friends put it, everybody has his or her Skokie, right? Every one of us, in truth, would probably say, well, there's just one exception I want to make. And if you added them up all together, there would be no free speech left. But anyway, knowing that Aryeh was the leader of the ACLU through this controversial period, people will be very, and knowing what a free speech champion he is, people would probably be very surprised that he made this statement. He said, much as I love free speech, I loathe the Nazis even more. I loathe the Nazis even more than I love free speech. So if I were convinced that stifling their free speech would have prevented the genocide and the Holocaust, then sign me up. But you can understand he reaches the opposite conclusion, that it would not have worked then, it would not work now. And in fact, many people are surprised to learn that the Weimar Republic, through which the Nazis rose to power in Germany, did have very strong anti-hate speech laws, very similar to the ones that Germany now enforces, and they were enforced rigorously. The leading Jewish organization in Germany said that Only a very small percentage of the cases were mishandled, so even leading Nazis were convicted, and Der Stürmer, which was a horrible anti-Semitic newspaper published by Julius Streicher, was convicted 36 times in a short period, and prison terms were served. But guess what? The Nazis loved this. It became a huge propaganda platform for them. They were able to purvey themselves as free speech martyrs. And very similar things are happening in this country, and I want to be very careful. I'm not at all comparing him to Hitler, but it's the very same technique that has been used brilliantly by Milo Yiannopoulos. When I was writing my book, in Friends, I had conversations with some of you, many other people in various bars and restaurants, and nobody had heard of Milo Yiannopoulos. They never heard of him until Berkeley and other places tried to shut him down. Now, the real difference between Nazi Germany and what we have in this country, thank goodness, is that the Nazis were, pre-Nazi Germany was not the free speech. That was not the problem. The problem was the violence that was unchecked. So the Nazis engaged in assassinations, assaults, physical violence, very serious against not only Jews but their political opponents. And there was not even a serious attempt to check that violence. So it would be as if we made no effort in this country to try to punish those who assassinated Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers and others. Okay, I think I'm going to make just one more point, Ari, because I do want to have time for questions. One of the problems with the hate speech laws, both in principle and in practicality, so I'm bringing both of those concerns together, is the inevitable subjectiveness of the concept, right? At its root, it is an emotion, hate. And just as we all have an infinite range of values and views, we will have an infinite range of views about what is hate. And one person's hate speech is somebody else's love speech. Let me give you examples. So Black Lives Matter has been denounced as hate speech by some law enforcement officials, by some politicians. A couple of state legislatures have considered resolutions to describe and decry Black Lives Matter advocacy as even a hate crime, let alone, and they've been blamed by some, including some politicians, for instigating assassinations of some police officers in Dallas a couple of years ago. Conversely, those who in any way criticize or question or even augment the concept of Black Lives Matter have themselves been accused of hate speech. So Blue Lives Matter has been attacked as hate speech against Black Lives Matter or African Americans. White Lives Matter, all lives matter has been critiqued in that way. So, you know, and I've seen everything from well, I won't give you examples, but basically, who gets to define really is where the power lies. And if you try to come up with a definition, I have a whole chapter here that challenges you. I've read every single proposed or enacted hate speech law from around the world, and it is just literally impossible to define precisely. And I want to give you a couple examples. So the very first hate speech code on college campuses that was adopted in the United States in the late 1980s, and the ACLU immediately went to court and had them struck down as unconstitutional. But the very first case was from the University of Michigan, and the key, and it was drafted by faculty experts from the University of Michigan Law School. So if anybody would be sensitive to carefully choosing the language, it could be those who wrote this code. And the key language was, it was penalizing words that stigmatize, victimize, or interfere with academic efforts. So during the oral argument, The judge, Abram Cohn, a wonderful judge, had been a leader of the ACLU before he was appointed to the court. He asked the university's counsel, well, you agree with the basic constitutional law principle, but that the mere fact that speech is offensive is not enough for it to be punished, right? And the lawyer says, right. So Judge Cohn says, well, how do you distinguish stigmatize, victimize, and interfering with academic efforts, which is not protected, from offensive, which is protected? And how do you distinguish? And the lawyer's answer was, very carefully. But at bottom, no laughing matter, right? Let me just give you a couple other examples. ECRI, this European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, and it's so ironic because they issued a report saying all of these European hate speech laws are too vague, they're too subjective, they're too discretionary, it's leading to disproportionate enforcement against advocacy on behalf of or by minority groups themselves, so you must rewrite the codes and the statutes in a more nuanced way. And so here's the guideline, among the guidelines that ECRI gave to make codes that are more precise. You should protect speech that merely offends, but you should not protect speech that is unnecessarily offensive. How's that for a guideline, folks? Canada, our neighbor to the north. So the key words in Canada's hate speech law are hateful or contemptuous speech. To give some robust, concrete meaning to that, the Canadian Supreme Court said, well, speech that conveys enmity is not protected, it's criminal, but speech that conveys disdain is protected. You know, with standards like this, it's not surprising that we see enforcement of, let me give you an example of enforcement in Canada, a case involving 4 flyers, 3 courts, and 3 different decisions. So there was a Christian activist who, as a matter of deep-seated Christian beliefs, thought that homosexuality is sinful. And by the way, it's not a view that I share, but much as I disagree with that view, I would not call it hateful, right? Because the motivation for trying to wean people away from what you consider something that will condemn them to hell, you may think it's misguided, it may violate your principles, but I don't think it's accurate to call it hate speech. But putting that aside, he had 4 flyers and was prosecuted under Canada's strict hate speech laws. It went before 3 courts, the trial level, the intermediate appellate court, and the Canadian Supreme Court. And the lowest level, the trial level court said all 4 flyers were criminal hate speech. He's convicted. The intermediate appellate court said the opposite, that 0 of the 4 flyers constituted hate speech. And guess what the Supreme Court of Canada did? 2 of them were, and 2 of them weren't. You know, and lest you think that the social media giants would be any better at enforcing their codes, please don't delude yourself. And I say that because there is such a hue and cry now. Oh, we need Facebook and Google and Twitter to be more aggressive in enforcing their community standards. They shouldn't allow so much hate speech, and they do it in a non-transparent way, but journalists have gotten some leaked documents. So last year, ProPublica got a treasure trove of documents from Facebook, which I'll just use as an example, with literally hundreds of pages and thousands of criteria that their thousands of minions and algorithms around the world use to distinguish what is punishable hate speech under Facebook's community codes. And it really illustrates, again, this inevitable problem. So one example is Facebook says that it is not hate speech to use language that is degrading of people, but it is hate speech to use language that is dehumanizing. You may use the adjective filthy to describe people or a group of people. That's not hate speech, but you may not use the noun filth to describe them. That is hate speech. Some of you may have noticed the New York Times actually had a quiz after ProPublica gave these examples, and it had 10 situations, and it just asked you how many of these, which of these do you think should be deemed to be hate speech and which not, and I guarantee you, you will all flunk it. So the upshot is, given these inevitably, inherently, inescapably subjective concepts, of course they are going to be enforced arbitrarily at best and discriminatorily at worst. No matter what your own political views are, you would be horrified by how the laws have actually been enforced, especially because they've been enforced against general ideas about urgent matters of public policy. Think of all the issues that are bound up in these sensitive concepts of race and gender and immigrant status and religion. You can't talk about them without making yourself subject to hate speech laws in Europe and Canada. Most recently, South Africa had an incident. Even politicians have been charged and convicted even when they are making campaign speeches. I'll just give you one example, because Glenn Greenwald, a liberal journalist in the United States, after Charlottesville, I'm sorry, not in the United States, he lives in Brazil, he's published all over the world, but including in The Guardian, a British newspaper. After Charlottesville, there was a predictable increase in demands for hate speech laws in the country. And I kind of understand it. People are frustrated. They're looking for a quick fix, but the quick fix is superficial and it doesn't work. So Glenn Greenwald, who had lived in many of these countries and was familiar with how the laws have actually operated, said, he wrote a column, he said, liberals are deluding themselves if they think that the law is only going to be enforced against what they consider to be hate speech, homophobia, misogyny, Islamophobia. Yes, the laws are often enforced in that way, but they're often enforced against speech that liberals love. And let me give you an example from France. It really hit close to home because it involved a human rights activist, namely the head of a Parisian LGBT rights organization was convicted under France's hate speech law and subject to a very large fine. Fortunately, she was not in prison. That's the only good thing you can say about this case, because she used the word homophobe to describe the head of an anti-gay rights organization. That was punishable hate speech. I said that no matter where you are in the political spectrum, you would be horrified. I could give you examples that would horrify you. And the ACLU is a strictly nonpartisan organization. My own temperament is very much that way. As I said earlier, we never endorse or oppose any candidate or party or organization. We will simply criticize or praise on an issue-by-issue basis. And this is an issue where I think all of us, no matter who we are, no matter what we believe, have a stake in preserving the First Amendment and using counter-speech. I deliberately sought endorsements for my book, and I was very happy to receive them from very prominent conservatives and Republicans, as well as very prominent liberals and progressives and Democrats. Let me just give you one example. I have to do this example because of all my musician friends who helped inspire my book and so many of Ellie's books who are in the audience, because it involves another great musician, not quite up to New Milford standards, but I guess we wouldn't kick him away, Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan was in France a couple of years ago to receive the highest award that is given in France, Légion d'honneur. And while he was there, he did an interview for Rolling Stone magazine, and they asked him a question about does racism still exist in the United States? And his answer was a riff on how people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds can sense the group that's there to oppress them. And he said, a Jew can always sense Nazi blood, and African American can always sense, I don't know, slave master. But then he said, and this was what got him in trouble, he said, a Serb can always sense if you have Croatian blood. Guess what? He was subject to 1 criminal and 3 civil actions under France's hate speech laws by various Croat organizations, criminal prosecution. Ultimately, just for that statement, and ultimately the charges were dismissed, but not because that did not consist of hate speech, rather because of the jurisdictional reason that he did not give permission to have the interview published in France. So the French prosecutors then indicted Rolling Stone, which was prosecuted for publishing that statement. And I'm going to give you just one other example because it's political speech, and we've been happy to be friends with political leaders of every major party and minor party persuasion here too. So this was a candidate for the European Parliament in Britain was giving a speech outside Town Hall, standing on the steps of Town Hall, and he read a statement from a passage from a book that the young Winston Churchill had written when Churchill was serving in the British military in something called the River Wars. Churchill made a very critical statement about what he called Mohammedanism. And interestingly enough, because I think just adds to the complexity, the particular critical statement was criticizing an aspect of Islam that allegedly allowed men too much domination over women, right? So you could say, well, it was critical of Islam, but it was supportive of women's rights. Whether or not you agree or disagree with what Churchill said and with the politician's decision to read that, here's what happened. At least 6, I'm very precise because some news accounts say even more than 6, police officers arrived on the scene while the candidate is giving his speech, arrest him, handcuff him, put him in the paddy wagon, drive him down to the police station, and hold him there in custody. They finally decided, he was charged with violating hate speech laws in Britain, and they finally let him go, but with this very severe warning. You do this again, and we may, in fact, prosecute you. So in other words, what we lawyers would call a gag order or prior restraint on future political speech. Interestingly enough, the harshest criticism of that came from his opponent in the European Parliament elections, who said, think about this, a candidate is arrested and charged with a crime for giving a hustings speech to his potential voters. You know, to talk about a political crime in a democracy is very strong wording, but what else is this? It's a thought crime and it's a speech crime. So I'm going to end where I began by thanking everybody who's here, everybody in this wonderful community for raising your voices, for not allowing yourselves to be censored or silenced, and not allowing the haters to do it to any members of our beloved community. I would like to end in that spirit by the way I end my book, which is quoting my favorite ACLU t-shirt, which reminds us that we have the right not to remain silent. Thank you very much.
We've ever had in this history ever. So thank you. This was absolutely fantastic. I think we have time for a few questions before our refreshments afterwards. Is there anyone who has any questions for Nadine Strassen? No questions? All right. Okay, we see some questions over here in the second round.
You had brought up Charlottesville, and that's where my folks live. My sister works for UVA. I mean, I understand in this wonderful, loving environment, it's easy to talk about these things, but in reality, they don't even have marches in Charlottesville anymore. I mean, it's not the first time Richard Spencer came to town. This is the first time he brought his friends with guns. And it wasn't just Heather Hare that was killed, it was a lot of people were beat up. I mean, it's a balancing act, because now I know someone who applied to go there, and she's a person of color, she's Asian, and she's like, what, am I supposed to lock myself in the dorm? I mean.
So this is thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about it. I was just in Charlottesville myself. As you probably know, an independent commission was appointed by the city government there to do a detailed study of all of the incidents, because you're exactly right that there were a series of them, not just the one in August. And it ends up being highly critical of the failure to prevent violence, very similar to what I said about the situation in Weimar, Germany. So it's severely critical of the Charlottesville Police Department, of the University Police Department, and of the Virginia State Police, all of which were involved, and they themselves were highly self-critical. Now, it's a very balanced, very detailed report, and for anybody who is interested in the situation, I highly recommend it. It's got an executive summary as well. And for each of the incidents, it says, here's what we did right, and here's what we did wrong. But what they did wrong was enormous, and as we've unfortunately seen in some other situations, there was complete lack of preparation, complete lack of training, failure to separate the contending forces, failure to provide communications among the different police groups that were involved, a complete absence of any police in the area where there was a confrontation between the two groups. So everybody agrees that it was a horribly handled situation, but not because either the demonstrators or the counter-demonstrators were allowed to be there. It was the failure to take adequate protective measures. And I met with the police officers when I was there. I won't forget it. It was the first day of spring, and I ended up being snowbound there. There's a lot to criticize, but not the fact that the speech was allowed to proceed.
But what about the guys that were beating up?
That's a crime, and there should have been police officers to stop that.
I don't think.
And you cannot say that, it's not a situation. So here's, if I can take your, I'll read into the question.
Sure.
A type of speech that would satisfy the emergency exception that did not occur there is what the court has called an intentional incitement of imminent violence, where the speaker intends the violence to happen imminently and it's likely to happen imminently. And that kind of instigation did not exist. I know there's a lawsuit that's trying to claim a more remote theory of causality, and even I've read the complaint and the supporting brief, they can't claim any such evidence at all. And the reason why we don't want government to have power to prevent speech, because it has a more remote, speculative, indirect connection to potential violence. That's what we used to have in this country, and that's what led to suppression of Martin Luther King and other civil rights demonstrators, and Emma Goldman and Margaret Sanger for advocating birth control and anti-war protesters, because their speech was dangerous and it might lead to violent conduct. So we want to be careful of loosening that tight, direct causal connection, which is to violence, which is a prerequisite for punishing speech.
I'm just going to say one more thing.
Sure, please.
I don't know if you were there for the Virginia Festival of the Books.
I
you
was.
should speak.
Thank you so much.
The
And
next one.
it was too late for this year because
Some
my
of the
book wasn't
forums are
my book
amazing.
wasn't published.
You
But
would
next
be
year,
perfect.
thank you so much. Thank you. Hi.
So on the heels of that, what happened in Boston?
Do you have it? I mean, I was not there, and I really haven't had time to talk to people about it. But I have kind of mixed feelings about it because I don't have enough information. Do you want to comment more specifically what your question
No,
was?
I was curious about your opinion. And the court of public opinion, of course, Boston took upon its moral code and said, we're shutting this down. And it was a community effort. And I was curious about your response to the fact that this was their perhaps agreed upon code, of how they would take matters in their own hands. So,
I mean, I was a little bit, certainly there was no violence and there was a huge counter demonstration, but the speakers, and here's what, I'm not going to use an adjective because here's where my information is incomplete and I have more questions than answers. Some people have described the proposed speakers as alt-right, white supremacists, but I've seen others saying, well, no, not necessarily. Some of the speakers were just people who were advocating freedom of speech. And there was this enormous pride, as you say, there seems to be pretty much univocal consensus that it was great that they ultimately didn't speak, I think, because maybe they feared violence, maybe the police escorted them away. And I guess I'd have to say, regardless of what their messages are, that does bother me. I think their counter speech, by the way, means that you can exercise your right to protest in a way that does not prevent the message you are disagreeing with from getting through, right? So if there's a willing speaker and a willing audience, they have the right to exercise their free speech rights to listen. You can try to persuade them not to, you can argue against, but you can't disrupt the event altogether. I would support, briefly standing up and booing, but not sustained booing so that people can't hear the speaker. Phil and then Buck.
At what point in a speech does it have to reach before it would become criminal if you're inciting a riot? Does the riot have to take place?
No, because that would be the law, as somebody said the law, I think somebody said the law is an ass, but it's not, is it? It would be ridiculous if we had to wait till the violence actually occurred. So that standard is if violence is likely to occur imminently, you don't have to wait for it to actually occur. And in determining whether that is likely, the courts are understandably deferential to law enforcement to make those judgments. So I think in Charlottesville it's interesting, the complaint is that the police did not react strongly enough to anticipated violence. They're not being criticized for it, for the opposite. Good question. Buck?
This is more on a personal level, as an attorney, as an ex-president of the ACLU, how do you deal with the emotional aspect? If you're required and let's use the Stokey, neo-Nazis in Stokey, I don't know if you were involved in that at all at that point in time, that was a long time ago. How do you deal emotionally with people that you despise, you hate? You probably don't want to be in the same room with them, but in the name of free speech, you become their advocate.
It's a great question, and I really appreciate it. Many people have asked me that, especially as the daughter of a Holocaust survivor and as a full-time human rights activist. And the truth is, I don't see them. I look through them to the underlying principle. And I see Martin Luther King. Let me tell you why. Because you may have noticed when I described that case, I said the ACLU came to the defense of the free speech rights of. I didn't say the ACLU defended the neo-Nazis because we were not defending them as people or as a certain idea. We were defending a principle, and that very same principle of viewpoint neutrality did protect Martin Luther King just a few years earlier in Cicero, Illinois, when he deliberately was leading an anti-segregation, pro-civil rights march in a highly segregated town where his views were highly unpopular, and he was trying to be provocative. Cicero, Illinois was for his civil rights march exactly what Skokie, Illinois was for the Nazis' march. And if we wanted him to have that right to choose his forum where his message would be effective and where he could reach the people he wanted to reach, then we had to defend that same principle for when the neo-Nazis were doing the same thing. And I really see it that way. Is there another question?
I'd like to say one last question.
Then you choose the last person.
I saw one over here. I can only see this side of the room.
Of course, we're not looking here either.
Oh, the other side. Sorry. Well, Arlene had her hand up.
the college students who are more pro-Palestinian. Do you see any progress being made or any?
Yeah, I do see a lot of progress. First of all, I'm a little bit agnostic on what the actual facts are, because there are the media, and I totally defend freedom of the press as well as freedom of speech, but I know that they're selective in what they report, and they tend to report certain sensationalized cases. So we cannot infer a general national pattern from the particular cases that are highlighted. And I've looked, but I've not seen any systematic studies of either issue. Conversely, I've seen conflicting studies about the extent to which pro-Israeli or pro-Zionist speakers have been suppressed. I've seen many indicia that it is largely suppressed or disproportionately suppressed, but there have also been studies that say that disproportionately suppressed are pro-Palestinian speakers. So I don't know what the facts are. Regardless of what the facts are, I would of course oppose any suppression of any message based on dislike of the speaker or the ideology or the perspective. And what I have witnessed is, it's impressions, but I'm speaking constantly on campus, so I have a lot of impressions that the students, on the whole, really hunger for a diversity of opinion and perspective and discourse, and they feel suppressed. They feel that they have to self-censor. I think conservatives on many campuses feel that more, but so do libertarians and even civil libertarians. In fact, I saw one of the Amazon Vine reviewers for my book said, every conservative should read this book, and it's really great to have a liberal who's critical of other liberals. So there are actually organizations, and this is what I love, that are organic, that are being created by students to foster more robust an exchange of ideas. One of them is called Bridge. It's started on many campuses around the country, kind of spontaneously, and now they're creating a national network. There's something else called Heterodox Academy. As its name implies, their statistics show that faculty members across the country, but particularly in the Northeast, are overwhelmingly liberal. And many serious social scientists and others have documented, regardless of what your own ideology is, that research and teaching are undermined in their effectiveness if you're not exposed to a multiplicity of viewpoints. I'm so glad. I saw that in my own experience. If it hadn't been for the surge of questioning about tried and true First Amendment principles, I would not have been driven to write my book in a way that could have led me to change my views. That would not be the worst thing in the world, right? We should be open-minded. But in fact, living up to John Stuart Mill's famous maxim, if you just hold an idea because it's always been, you've always had that idea, then it becomes calcified orthodoxy. But if it's subject to challenge, then you have to re-examine it and defend it, and you refine your own thinking and your own articulation of your thoughts. So I personally experienced that. All of which is to say, wearing my hat as an educator, as well as wearing my hat as a civil liberties activist, we have to foster intellectual diversity at every level and make campus a safe space for not only every person of every ethnic, racial, religious, et cetera, description, but a safe space for people of every ideological, religious, political belief. No matter who you are, no matter what you believe, you are entitled to human dignity, including freedom of expression. So I look forward to continuing our exchange over wine and music.
We hope everyone will enjoy the music. The Mike Latini in the back and have a glass glass of wine and purchase a copy of the book, have it signed. If you're not going to do that, have a second glass of wine and then purchase the book. And then afterwards, there's an after party at Italia Mia this evening. So feel free to head over there afterwards. Thank you, everyone.